The espresso was wrong before she even set it down. Zara knew it the way she knew most things. Quietly, certainly, without needing to announce it. The grind was too coarse. The extraction too fast. The crema thin as paper and already dying at the edges by the time it crossed the counter. She'd made it herself, which meant the fault was hers, which meant she would fix it before the man in the charcoal suit had the chance to taste disappointment. She pulled it back. He looked up. That was her first mistake. Meeting his eyes. They were dark. Not the soft dark of warm rooms or late evenings. The dark of deep water. The kind that didn't reflect light so much as absorb it. He watched her take the cup from the space in front of him with the particular stillness of a man who was never surprised and never showed it when he was. No anger. No confusion. Just that steady, unreadable gaze tracking her hands like she was something worth studying. Zara set the cup behind the counter and began again. "You'll hate it," she said without looking at him. "Trust me." The cafe was not quiet. The machine hissed. Somewhere near the window, two women argued softly over a phone screen. A man in a rumpled jacket read a newspaper no one printed anymore. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary morning. And yet the air near him was different. Denser, somehow. Like the room had adjusted its posture without anyone noticing. Zara noticed. She always noticed. Welcome to Afro Korean Tales and Stories. The home of Afro-Korean love stories where passion crosses cultures and hearts learn new languages. If you're new here, this channel is dedicated to powerful, emotional stories between Black women and Korean men. Filled with romance, tension, longing, and moments that stay with you long after the story ends. And to our returning family, welcome back. Your love, comments, and support keep these stories alive. Before the story continues, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new tale. Now tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what part of this story is already pulling at your heart? Let's connect. Let's feel the story together. Matteo De Luca had not been spoken to like that in longer than he cared to calculate. Not rudely, that happened often enough, usually right before it stopped happening permanently. This was something else. The woman behind the counter had not looked at him when she spoke, had not softened the words with a smile or sharpened them with attitude. She had simply stated a fact and moved on, her hands already working the machine with the efficiency of someone who found people less interesting than precision. He should have been irritated. He was not. He watched her work. She was unhurried in a way that wasn't performance. No studied calm, no careful elegance. Just a woman who existed in her body without apology, reaching for the portafilter the way you reach for something familiar. She wore no jewelry except a thin gold ring on her right hand, fourth finger. Not a wedding band. Something older. Inherited, maybe. He filed that away without knowing why. Around him, two of his men sat at a table near the door, jackets unbuttoned the precise amount that said ready to anyone who understood the language. They were always there. He had stopped seeing them years ago. What he saw now was the way the woman's eyes moved briefly to their reflection in the polished surface of the espresso machine, a glance so fast it barely qualified as one, and then away. She had clocked them. She had not reacted. That was unusual enough to be interesting. The second cup was right. Zara could tell before she poured it. The crema settled thick and even, the color of burnt caramel, holding its surface with the quiet confidence of something done correctly. She placed it in front of him without ceremony. 30 seconds, she said. He looked at the cup. Then at her. Before you drink it, she added. Let it breathe. Coffee doesn't breathe. Everything breathes. She moved to the register. 30 seconds, or you'll burn the taste out. There was a pause. The kind that in other circumstances might have been a warning. In her experience, powerful men did not like being told to wait. They liked it least when they had no reasonable argument against it. He waited. 30 seconds. She counted them in her head, busy with nothing, pretending not to watch. When she glanced back, he had lifted the cup. His eyes closed for a moment, just a moment, as he drank. He set it down. He said nothing. But he didn't leave. Zara had been working this cafe for 14 months. In that time, she had memorized the routes of 17 different men who passed through its doors with a specific, contained energy of people who moved through the world differently than civilians did. Men who sat with their backs to the wall. Men who ordered the same thing every time and left exact change. Men who never brought their phones out in public. She had files on 9 of them. She was building a file on him. She did not know his name yet. Not from him, not directly. But she had seen the difference in the way the 2 men near the door had moved when he entered. The slight shift. The almost imperceptible straightening. Like plants turning toward light they feared and needed in equal measure. Whoever he was not merely dangerous. He was the danger. The kind other dangers organized themselves around. Zara wiped down the counter in long, even strokes and told herself this was fine. That she had been closer to worse. That the ring on her hand, her mother's ring, had been worn into rooms far more perilous than this one, by a woman who had not survived them. Zara intended to survive. That required not doing what she was currently doing, which was noticing the way he turned the small cup once in his hand before setting it down. A habit. A private one. Not performance. She looked away. Mateo left exact change on the counter. He stood, buttoned his jacket, one button, the middle, and reached for nothing because he had brought nothing. No phone on the table. No briefcase. No newspaper. Just himself and the coffee and whatever calculation had been running behind his eyes the entire time. He paused at the counter. Zara was already moving toward the other end, cloth in hand. She did not stop. Did not look up. Did not offer the smile that service workers offered powerful-looking men who paused near them with intention. "You corrected my order," he said. "It was wrong. Most people don't point that out." She considered the counter she was wiping. Most people would rather be polite than right. Another pause. Longer this time. "And you?" She finally looked at him. Briefly. Direct. "I'd rather be right," she said. He held her gaze for exactly 1 second. Then he walked toward the door, his men rising silently from their chairs without being told, falling into formation behind him like a tide following something it couldn't name. Zara watched the door settle closed. Her hand, still flat against the counter, pressed down without her meaning it to. Because in the single second he had held her gaze, she had seen something she had not expected to find in a man like that. Not cruelty, not hunger, not the usual cold weight of unchecked power. Curiosity. Pure, careful, dangerous curiosity. Directed entirely at her. Mateo sat in the back of the car and said nothing for 4 minutes. His men did not speak either. They had learned the shape of his silences long ago, which ones meant wait, which ones meant speak, which ones meant the conversation was already over. This one was new. "Tomorrow," he said finally. The driver's eyes moved to the mirror. "Sir." Mateo looked out the window at the city arranging itself around the car, obedient as always. "We come back tomorrow." He came back the next morning. Zara had told herself he wouldn't. Not because she believed it, but because believing it had felt necessary. A small, practical armor she'd built between closing time and sleep. Men like him didn't return to ordinary places out of anything as simple as preference. They returned because they wanted something. And men like him, when they wanted something, eventually took it. She had the second espresso ready before he reached the counter. He stopped, looked at the cup, looked at her. 30 seconds, she said, and walked away. Behind her, she heard the soft sound of him settling onto the stool. The particular quality of his stillness, that dense, contained quiet, filled the space between them like a held breath. She counted the seconds without meaning to. She was already doing it, already tracking him. That was the first sign she should have paid attention to. He came back the day after that. And the day after that. By the 5th morning, Zara had mapped him the way she mapped everything. Methodically, without sentimentality, building a picture from the fragments he left behind. He arrived between 7:40 and 7:55. Never later. Occasionally earlier by a minute or two, which suggested a variable in his schedule between home and here, something that shifted but didn't control him. He sat at the counter, never a table. Always the same stool, slightly left of center, which put his back at an angle to the door rather than directly facing it. Not the instinctive choice of a paranoid man, but the deliberate choice of a strategic one. He could see the entrance in his periphery without appearing to watch it. He always left exact change. Always one button fastened on his jacket. Always the same two men near the door, though occasionally a third appeared. Younger, quieter, with the careful eyes of someone still learning the language. He never brought anything to read. He never looked at his phone. He just drank his coffee and, more often than not, talked to her. Not about anything significant. That was what made it significant. "You've worked here long?" he asked on the 6th morning. "Long enough." Zara set his cup down. "Why?" "You know everyone's order. That's the job. You know when they're going to change it before they do." She paused. Only slightly. People are predictable. His eyes moved over her face in that way he had, slow and measuring without being intrusive, like he was reading something written in a language he was still translating. "Most people find that unsettling," he said. "Being read. Do you?" The corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one, the outline of what a smile might look like on a face that had forgotten the habit. "I find it interesting," he said. Zara turned back to the machine before her own expression could answer him. On the 9th day, he told her his name. Or rather, he allowed it, the way you allow something that was already happening, that you've simply decided to stop resisting. He was midway through his coffee when the younger of the two men near the door approached and murmured something close to his ear. Something tightened in his jaw. Not visible, not quite. But Zara was watching the reflection in the machine, and she caught it. "Matteo." The young man's voice was low, but the cafe was quiet that morning. He didn't look at her when the man withdrew. He lifted his cup. "Set it down." "Bad news?" she asked. "News," he said. "Good and bad are editorial. Spoken like someone who decides which is which." This time the smile was real. Brief as a match strike, and just as quickly gone. But real. "Matteo." She already knew it, had known it for 6 days, confirmed through a source that cost her a favor she'd been saving. But hearing it said aloud in his proximity felt different. It made him solid in a way that was inconvenient. Names did that. They collapsed the distance between observation and reality. She filed it away under the wrong category and kept moving. By the 2nd week, the rhythm between them had become something she didn't have a clinical word for. He spoke in the spaces she left. She left them deliberately, not out of warmth, she told herself, but because silence made people fill it with truth. It was an interview technique. An extraction method. Nothing more. He talked about the city the way a man talks about something he owns and is tired of owning. He talked about traffic and architecture, about a building on the east side that had been gutted and rebuilt 3 times without ever becoming what it was meant to be. He talked about coffee in Rome and why it was inferior to what people claimed. He talked about loyalty like it was a financial instrument, something with measurable yield and inevitable depreciation. He never talked about himself directly. Everything he said was himself, refracted. Zara understood that method intimately. She used it too. It was the 14th morning when something shifted. He arrived at 7:41. Saturday. Said nothing while she made the espresso. When she placed it in front of him, he didn't reach for it immediately. He was looking at his hands, both of them flat on the counter, still, the way you lay your hands flat when you're deciding whether to say the thing you came to say. "My father died in a room like this," he said. Zara went still. Small. Ordinary. His voice was the same, even unhurried. But underneath it, something moved. He always said ordinary rooms were the safest. No one expects anything important to happen in them. She didn't respond. She had learned by now that response was the wrong instinct with him. He didn't want response. He wanted witness. He was wrong, Matteo said. He picked up the cup, drank, set it down, and then, as cleanly as a door closing, nothing. The shutters came down behind his eyes. The openness, That fractional, startling openness sealed itself away as if it had never existed. He reached into his jacket for the money, set it on the counter, and straightened. "Same time tomorrow," he said. Not a question. Not quite a statement. An assumption. He left before she could form a response, his men rising and following in that silent practice tide, and the door settled shut, and the cafe filled back in with its ordinary sounds, the machine, the murmur of strangers, the city pressing itself against the glass. Zara stood at the counter. She pressed her mother's ring against her palm with her thumb, a private habit, a grounding mechanism. She did it when she needed to remember the reason for everything. The mission, the method, the math of it all. But what she was thinking about was not her mother. She was thinking about the way his voice had changed, only barely, only for a moment, when he said "my father." She was thinking that she had heard grief in controlled men before, had catalogued it as data, had used it when necessary without losing sleep. She was thinking that this time felt different. And that was the most dangerous thing she had learned in 14 mornings. Not his name. Not his patterns. Not the men at the door or the way he read a room. The fact that she was no longer just watching him. The photograph landed on the desk at 11:47 p.m. Matteo didn't touch it. He looked at it the way he looked at most things that required a decision, without expression, without the luxury of feeling first. It was a surveillance photo, grainy at the edges, shot from across a street with a long lens. The timestamp in the corner read 6 days ago. It showed Zara leaving the cafe. It showed her getting into a car. His car, the unmarked one, because it had been raining and he had offered without meaning to, and she had accepted without making anything of it. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching. He picked up the photograph. Set it back down. Looked at the man who had brought it, Rico, his head of intelligence, who had the decency to stand with his eyes on the floor rather than on Matteo's face. "When did you get this?" Matteo asked. "An hour ago." It came through the Eastern Channel. Volkov. His people. Yes. Matteo sat back. The leather of his chair made no sound. The room made no sound. Outside, the city hummed its indifferent hum, 20 floors below, knowing nothing and caring less. "There's more," Rico said. There always was. They had a name for her. Not her real name, they hadn't gotten that far, or if they had, it wasn't in what Rico had intercepted. They called her La Finestra, the window, because that was what she was to them. Not a target in herself. A way in. A pane of glass through which they intended to see everything Matteo had kept dark. The contract wasn't on her life. It was on her usefulness. Which was, in certain respects, worse. Rico laid the rest of it on the desk. 3 more photographs. A page of intercepted communication, partially decoded. A name, a fixer out of Belgrade, who specialized not in killing but in extraction. In leverage. In finding the soft things powerful men kept close and making those soft things scream. Matteo read everything once. He did not read it again. "Options," he said. Rico shifted his weight. He was a careful man, Rico, loyal not from fear but from a long-standing understanding that Matteo's judgment had never, in 11 years, been catastrophically wrong. He chose his words accordingly. "We move her. Safe house outside the city, 2 men on the door. We control her contact with the outside world until—" "No. Matteo. She disappears. They know she matters." His voice was flat. Factual. They're already watching her. A sudden absence tells them everything a photograph couldn't. Rico was quiet for a moment. "Then we find the fixer first. We're already 3 days behind. He doesn't wait. So we find him fast." "And if we don't?" Matteo asked. Not rhetorically. He wanted the answer said aloud. He wanted Rico to stand in the room and say what came next. Rico said it. "Then they take her. And they use her to take everything else." The room was very quiet after that. Matteo stood at the window for a long time after Rico left. The city spread below him, obedient and glittering, a network of lit windows and moving cars that from this height looked almost peaceful. He had built things in that city. He had broken things. He had made decisions that rearranged lives the way weather rearranged landscapes, without apology, without ceremony, because that was the nature of force. He did not think of himself as a man who felt fear. What moved through him now was something adjacent to it. Not the same animal. Something older and colder and more precise. The feeling of watching a calculation fail in real time, of running the numbers and finding that no outcome produced what you needed. He thought about Zara. Not sentimentally. He did not have the luxury of sentiment tonight. He thought about her the way he thought about any variable that had suddenly become a liability, with total, ruthless clarity. How many mornings? How many conversations, each one a thread he hadn't noticed himself weaving? The way she'd looked at his hands when he spoke about his father, not with pity, not with hunger, but with the careful attention of someone storing information they intended to keep. He had told himself it was nothing. The city outside didn't judge him for the lie. He pressed 2 fingers against the glass. She had a mother's ring on her hand and a way of leaving silence open just long enough for truth to fall into it, and someone in Belgrade had noticed her face 6 days ago through a long lens on a rainy street, and that was the entire problem. Not that she was in danger. That she was in danger because of him. His advisors arrived at midnight. There were 4 of them. Men who had navigated crises before, who understood the calculus of sacrifice and survival. They spread their recommendations across his desk like cards, each one a version of the same fundamental logic. Protect the operation. Contain the exposure. Remove the variable. She's a civilian, one of them said. A man named Caruso, who had been with Matteo's family since before Matteo was old enough to understand what that meant. She doesn't know what she's walked into. She's already in it, another said. Then walk her out. Quietly. Pay her if you have to. Relocate her, change her name, give her a life somewhere with no connection to this one. Caruso kept his voice reasonable. She doesn't have to be harmed. She just has to disappear. Matteo looked at him. And when they follow her, he asked. When her disappearance tells them she was never nothing to me? Caruso's mouth closed. They're not watching her because they want her, Matteo said. They're watching her because they want me to move. To react. To confirm what they suspect. He looked at each face in turn. Every protection I put on her is a flag I'm planting that says this one matters. The room absorbed this. Then what? Caruso asked. Quietly. The way you ask a question when you already know you won't like the answer. Matteo turned back to the window. The city was still there. Patient. Indifferent. I take the flag away, he said. He made the call at 12:43 a.m. Not to Rico. Not to Caruso. To a man who carried messages the way arteries carry blood. Fast, essential, without question. Tell her it's urgent, Matteo said. Tell her to come to the estate. A pause on the line. And if she asks why. Matteo's reflection looked back at him from the dark glass. A man in a dark suit in a dark room, holding a phone, about to do the one thing he had never in his life done to someone who didn't deserve it. She won't ask why, he said. She'll come. He ended the call. He stood there for another moment. One moment, the last one he allowed himself, and then he moved away from the window and began to prepare. Not for a meeting. For a performance. The kind that left no room for correction. No room for mercy. No room for the look on her face to change what he'd already decided. He was going to destroy her in front of witnesses. And she was going to let him, because she wouldn't see it coming. Because she trusted him. God help him. She trusted him. She knew something was wrong before she crossed the threshold. The estate had a particular quality of silence, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of held breath. Of many people in one room choosing not to move. Zara had walked through dangerous silences before. She recognized this one the way you recognize a smell from childhood. Instantly, in the body, before the mind catches up. The man who had collected her said nothing during the drive. That was the first signal. He was one of Matteo's quieter men, but there was quiet and there was this, a sealed, almost apologetic absence of sound, like a person who knows what waits at the end of the road and has decided that kindness requires saying nothing. She had dressed for the cafe. Simple black dress. Flat shoes. The smell of coffee still in her hair. She had not dressed for whatever this was. The doors opened. The dining hall was full. Not with dinner. There were no plates, no glasses, no evidence of anything as ordinary as a meal. There were men. 15, perhaps 20, arranged along the walls and at the long table with the careful positioning of an audience that had been told where to stand. Crystal chandeliers threw gold across everything. The light was beautiful and merciless. Mateo stood at the head of the table. He was looking at her when she entered. He had been looking at the door, waiting. That was what she noticed first, that he had been waiting, which meant he had been thinking about this moment in advance, which meant every second of what followed was chosen. She crossed the room toward him. The floor was marble. Her footsteps were small, precise sounds in all that silence. No one looked at her directly. They looked at the middle distance, at the table, at their own hands. The studied non-observation of men who understood that what they were about to witness was not for their benefit, and yet had been arranged precisely for them to see. She stopped 6 feet away. "You came," Mateo said. His voice was the same. That was the terrible thing. The same even register, the same unhurried pace. As if they were in the cafe. As if this were any other morning. "You said it was urgent," she replied. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Too fast, too contained, and then it was gone. What replaced it was nothing she had seen before. A blankness so complete it almost looked like calm. "I did," he said. "There's something that needs to be addressed." He let the silence sit. Around her, no one breathed. Zara had spent 14 months cultivating patience as a professional instrument. She had sat across from men who used silence as a weapon, who stretched it thin and sharp and waited for the other person to cut themselves on it. She had learned to wait longer, to let it be their discomfort, not hers. But this was different. This was Mateo. "There are rumors," he said, "about you, about what you imagine your position here to be." She held very still. "I don't imagine anything," she said. "Clearly you do." His voice didn't rise. "It didn't need to. You've been seen leaving in my car. Arriving when I arrive. People talk. People make assumptions about women who place themselves in proximity to men like me." The word women landed like a hand on her shoulder, pressing down. Deliberate. Reducing. "I didn't place myself anywhere," she said quietly. "No." He tilted his head. A slight movement. Surgical. "Then explain to me why a waitress from a cafe on the east side is a recurring presence in my schedule." In the walls of her chest, something cracked. Hairline fracture. Nothing visible. She said nothing. "You've mistaken attention for something it wasn't," Mateo continued. He turned slightly, not looking at her anymore, which was somehow worse than the looking. "I visit many establishments. I have many conversations. That you interpreted those conversations as anything beyond." He paused. "Let it breathe. Let the whole room breathe it in. Anything beyond basic courtesy is a misunderstanding I should have corrected sooner." "Stop," she told herself. "Listen to it. All of it. Don't react. Don't give them that." She listened. "You mean nothing to me," he said. 4 words. Simple. Clean. Delivered with the precision of something that had been prepared. She understood precision. She used it herself. And because she understood it, she heard the thing underneath the words, the mechanical quality of them, the way they sat in his mouth like something memorized rather than felt. She heard it. It did not help. Because the part of her that had pressed her mother's ring into her palm for 14 mornings and told herself it was research, it was proximity, it was data, that part did not care about the mechanical quality. That part received the words at face value, folded them inward, and began to bleed quietly in a place no one in this room would ever see. "Nothing," he repeated. The word fell into the silence, and the silence swallowed it whole. Around the room, not one face moved. That was its own violence. 20 men who had heard, who would remember, who would carry this out of the estate and into the city where it would travel faster than any car, any message, any bullet. That was the point. She understood that too, somewhere beneath the fracture, in the part of her that never stopped working. She understood all of it. She still felt destroyed. Zara looked at him for one moment, one full, clear, unflinching moment. She did not let her eyes go soft. She did not let her jaw tremble or her hands move or any of the 100 small betrayals the body attempted when the mind was in crisis. She looked at him the way she had looked at everything in this city, as something to be understood, catalogued, survived. He met her eyes. Something passed through his. Fast. Gone. Understood, she said. Her voice came out steady. She would be grateful for that later. In the long quiet of whatever came next, she would hold on to the steadiness of those 2 syllables and be grateful. She turned. She walked the length of the marble floor in silence. Past the men who stared at nothing. Past the table with its empty surface and the chandeliers with their frozen gold light. Past the door that someone opened without being asked, because of course they did, because in places like this everything was choreographed, even the exits. She walked through it. She did not look back. Not once. Not a glance over the shoulder, not a hesitation in her step, not a single backward movement that might have told anyone in that room, told him, that the words had found anything worth finding. The door closed behind her. The night air hit her face. Cool. Indifferent. Real. She kept walking. Matteo did not move. He stood at the head of the table and listened to the sound of her footsteps crossing the gravel outside, growing smaller, then gone. Around him, his men remained precisely where they were, because they understood this shape of silence too, the kind that required no comment, no debrief, no acknowledgement that anything had happened at all. His right hand was on the edge of the table. He became aware of it slowly, the pressure of it, the way his fingers had curled against the wood without his instruction. He looked down. The edge of the table had taken an impression from his grip. A faint one. Barely visible. He released it. He thought. She didn't flinch. He thought. Not once. He thought. I've sent men to their knees with less, and she walked out of here like I was weather. Like I was something to be endured and forgotten. And beneath all of it, beneath the performance he had just completed and the reason for it and the cold logic that had constructed every word, beneath all of it, one thing sat in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, sinking slow. He did not know if he had saved her. He did not know if what he'd just destroyed was a contract on her life, or the only real thing he'd had in years. He did not know which loss he could survive. The cafe was open. That was the first thing. The lights were on, the sign turned, the door unlocked. A young man behind the counter with careful hands and no particular awareness of what the room had been 3 days ago. He smiled when Matteo entered. An ordinary smile. The smile of someone who had never been told to be careful. Matteo stood in the doorway for 1 moment longer than necessary. The stool at the counter, slightly left of center, was empty. The machine behind the bar was the same machine. The smell was the same. Coffee and something faintly citrus, which he now understood had been her, not the room. He sat. "What can I get you?" the young man asked. Matteo looked at the counter. At the exact space where she had stood every morning for 14 days, correcting his order before he could make the mistake of placing it wrong. At the surface she had wiped in long, even strokes while he talked about things he hadn't meant to say aloud. "Espresso," he said. The young man made it without comment. Set it down with a small spoon on the saucer, which she had never done. A small wrong detail in an already wrong morning. "The woman who worked here," Matteo said. Carefully. Casually. The tone of someone asking about nothing. "She's not in today." "Oh." The young man shrugged, apologetic and entirely uninvested. "She doesn't work here anymore. Left a couple days ago, I think. Manager just said she was gone." Matteo picked up the cup. "Gone," he repeated. "Yeah." Another shrug. "Happens." He drank the espresso. It was wrong. Too fast, too bitter, the crema already dead before it reached him. He left exact change on the counter and walked out without finishing it. Gone. He turned the word over in the car. Examined it from different angles the way you examine a wound, not for pain, but for depth, for what it might mean about what came next. She had left within 48 hours of the estate. That was fast. Too fast for a woman who had simply been embarrassed and decided to find different employment. People who were merely hurt took time. They finished their shifts, they said quiet goodbyes, they let the ordinary machinery of their lives carry them away from the thing that hurt them. They did not vanish. Find her address, he told Rico that afternoon. Rico came back in 2 hours. Which was already unusual. Rico was efficient, but city records, lease agreements, utility accounts all took time to navigate even with the access they had. There's nothing, Rico said. Mateo looked up from his desk. Say that again. The address she listed for employment, the apartment doesn't exist. The number doesn't correspond to any building on that street. Rico set a single page on the desk. The name she used for her employment records traces to a social security number that was issued to someone who died in infancy in 1987. The room was very still. She gave a false identity to the cafe, Mateo said. She gave a false identity everywhere. Rico's voice was careful, measured. We can't find a rental agreement, a bank account, a phone contract. Nothing that leads to a real person. Mateo looked at the page. At the name he had known her by, the only name he had ever used, the name that now sat on the paper like a door that opened onto nothing. Then who was she? He asked. Rico didn't answer. Because Rico didn't know. The first call came at 7 that evening. It was from Benedetti, a man who controlled 3 port operations on the southern coast, who had been a reliable partner for 9 years, who communicated in short, pragmatic sentences and never called without a reason worth calling for. There's a problem, Benedetti said, with the Marseille shipment. What kind of problem? The kind where it doesn't arrive. Mateo set down his pen. Elaborate. The freighter turned around 6 hours out. Captain says he received new documentation showing the cargo manifest was flagged by customs intelligence. Not local customs. International. The flag came from inside the system. A pause. Someone filed a report using paperwork that doesn't exist in any of our channels. Meaning someone created it. Meaning someone who understood exactly how our paperwork works created a version of it that didn't. Good enough to turn a captain around. Too specific to be a guess. Mateo said nothing for a moment. Handle it, he said. And find out where the filing originated. He ended the call. He sat in his chair and looked at the wall and felt, for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, the specific unease of not knowing something he needed to know. By the second day, there were 2 more calls. A financial account, one of 7 shell structures he used to move money between legitimate fronts, had been suspended pending review by a regulatory body that should not have known it existed. The suspension was clean, proper, filed with the kind of documentation that took either months of careful work or an intimate understanding of the architecture it was attacking. An intermediary in Geneva, a man who had facilitated communications between Mateo and 3 allied families for 6 years, went quiet. No returned calls. No message through secondary channels. By evening, a contact confirmed he had left Geneva entirely. Destination unknown. Mateo walked the length of his office 14 times. Rico watched from the doorway with the expression of a man assembling a picture he didn't want to finish. It's coordinated, Mateo said. Not a question. Yes. It's not Volkov. His people don't work like this. They're blunt. This is precise. Yes. It's financial. Logistical. Whoever is doing this understands the internal structure of the operation. He stopped walking. Not the surface. The skeleton. Rico's silence was its own answer. Mateo turned to look at him fully. Who has that kind of access? From the outside? Rico shook his head slowly. No one. This isn't hacked or intercepted. This is... He stopped. Started again. This is someone who learned it from proximity. From observation. from being close enough, long enough, to understand how each piece connects to the next. The word proximity landed in Mateo's chest like something dropped from a height. He thought about a woman who learned his moods without asking questions, who knew when to speak and when not to, who looked at the reflection in the espresso machine when his men entered the room, who never once asked him what he did for a living, who never once looked afraid. He drove to the cafe himself that night. No men, no car with tinted windows. He drove alone, which he hadn't done in years, because suddenly the presence of witnesses felt unbearable. The street was quiet. The cafe was dark, not closed for the evening dark, but empty dark. The kind of dark that accumulates when a space has been abandoned rather than simply locked. He got out. He stood on the pavement and looked through the glass. Inside, the counter was bare. The machine was gone. The stools had been stacked against the wall by someone performing the mechanical tidying of a space being handed back. The small sign she had kept near the register, something printed, too far to read in the dark, was gone. Like she had never existed. Like 14 mornings were something he had constructed alone. He pressed his hand flat against the glass. He had done this to protect her. He had calculated and decided and performed and destroyed, and she had walked away with her dignity intact, and he had told himself the pain of it was the price of keeping her alive. But she hadn't run from the threat. She had moved. With purpose. With preparation. With the speed of someone who had not been surprised, who had simply been waiting for the signal to activate something already in place. His hand was still on the glass. Behind his eyes, pieces began rearranging themselves with the slow, inevitable momentum of a truth that had been present all along, patient as stone, waiting for him to be still enough to see it. She had known. Not everything, but enough. And someone, something, she had set in motion before she ever walked out of his estate was currently reaching into the bones of his empire. And pulling. She had not cried. Not in the car on the way back from the estate. Not in the safe house she'd moved to 3 months ago in anticipation of exactly this kind of rupture. Not in the 48 hours since she'd walked across marble floors and out of Matteo De Luca's life with 2 syllables and her spine straight. She had packed what needed packing, which was very little, because she had always lived like someone prepared to disappear, and she had made calls and she had begun. Crying was for after. There might not be an after. There never had been before. The room she worked from now was on the 4th floor of a building that appeared, on paper, to belong to a property management company that appeared, on further paper, to belong to a retired civil servant in Lyon. 3 monitors. 1 laptop. A whiteboard covered in notation that would look like nothing to anyone without the specific education required to read it. A cot in the corner she used for 2 or 3 hours when she had to. She stood at the whiteboard and did not look at the cot. She had work to do. Her mother's name was Adiz Okoye. Zara allowed herself this, the name spoken inside her own head, before she began. A ritual. A reason. The thing she returned to when the work became the kind of work that required justification. Adiz Okoye had been a journalist for 21 years. She had covered conflict, corruption, the slow administrative violence of systems that ate people quietly and called it order. She had published in 4 languages. She had been threatened 11 times in a career that took her from Lagos to Brussels to the back channels of Eastern European financial crime. The 12th threat had not come as a message. It had come as a car accident on a wet road outside Milan, 11 years ago, 6 weeks before she was due to publish an investigation into a network of criminal enterprises laundering money through legitimate European financial institutions. The investigation disappeared with her. The police closed the case in 4 months. Zara had been 21 years old. She had sat in the back of a church in a city that wasn't home and watched them lower her mother into ground and thought. Not in grief, not yet. The grief came later in pieces, in inconvenient moments, in the smell of a particular ink her mother had always used. She had thought, I'm going to finish it. It had taken her 10 years to be ready. She had studied with the patience of someone who understood that preparation was not delay. It was foundation. Finance. International monetary systems. The specific architecture of shell companies and beneficial ownership structures, and the ways criminal money learned to swim in clean water without disturbing the surface. Digital security. Network mapping. The behavioral patterns of closed organizations. How they communicated, how they trusted, how they failed. She had worked for 2 years at a regulatory consultancy in Geneva, 8 months with a financial intelligence unit in Brussels, a year and a half embedded in a task force that officially didn't exist and was funded by 3 governments who officially didn't cooperate. She had built a network of people who, like her, understood that the system had seams, that if you found the right seam and pulled, the whole architecture of a thing could be made to show its bones. Then she had taken a job in a cafe. Because Matteo De Luca was not her only target. But he was the connector, the arterial node through which 4 of the 7 enterprises on her mother's unfinished list had routed money, favors, protection, and power for a decade. Not the source. The infrastructure. Proximity mattered more than power. She had believed that completely. Until she hadn't. Zara sat down at the center monitor and opened a file she had last accessed 3 months ago. A deliberate delay, a boundary she had set herself when she'd realized the cafe was no longer only a post. She had promised herself, if the work required it, she would open it. The work required it. The file contained 14 months of documentation. Financial routing. Communication intercepts. Organizational charts mapped from behavioral observation rather than intelligence leaks. Because intelligence could be wrong, could be planted, but behavior, watched long enough and carefully enough, was its own confession. She had more on Matteo De Luca's operation than his own accountants did. Not because she was smarter than his security. Because she had sat across a counter from him every morning and listened. She had not planned to fall in love. That required acknowledging it plainly. She was a precise person, and imprecision in self-accounting was a form of cowardice she refused. She had fallen in love with him. Not with the power or the darkness or the particular romance of dangerous men that she had always understood intellectually and never felt in practice. With the way he waited 30 seconds before drinking his coffee. With the way he spoke about his father in the past tense and then sealed the door before she could say a word. With the shape of his silence. The way it was never empty, always occupied by something he had decided not to inflict on anyone else. She had fallen in love with a man she was simultaneously building a case against. And when he had looked at her across a marble floor and said, "You mean nothing to me," she had heard the mechanism of it, the constructed cruelty, the audience, the strategic erasure, and she had understood it for what it was. And it had still felt like falling. She pressed her mother's ring against her palm. Then she began to pull threads. The first was the Marseille shipment. Simple enough. She had the manifest codes, the customs intelligence filing procedures, the authentication signatures used by the regulatory layer his operation had co-opted years ago. She filed a flag using documentation that was almost right. Just wrong enough to be unrecognizable to his people. Just right enough to be believed by everyone else. The second was the Geneva intermediary. She didn't touch him directly. She sent a message, through a channel he thought was private and wasn't, that contained enough accurate information about his arrangement with Matteo that his only rational response was to run. People who had built their safety on being unknown moved very fast when someone proved they weren't. The third was the account. This one took longer. 4 hours of careful work, tracing the ownership chain back through 7 layers of incorporated anonymity to the point where the structure had a single vulnerability. A regulatory filing that had been completed incorrectly in 2019 and never corrected, because no one had ever looked closely enough to find it. She corrected it now. In the direction of a flag. By dawn she had done 3 more. Small. Precise. Each one a stone removed from a wall that looked, from the outside, entirely solid. At 6 a.m. she stood and stretched and looked at what she had built across the monitors. A map. A living one. Matteo's empire rendered not in territory or bodies but in the invisible architecture of money and communication and trust, and across it, 6 new wounds, none of them fatal, all of them deliberate. She had not done this for revenge. She needed to remember that. Her mother's investigation had not been an act of revenge either. It had been an act of documentation, of insisting that the hidden thing be seen, that the cost of the system, paid in lives that didn't make the ledger, be entered into the record. Zara was finishing it. The fact that Matteo had looked at her across a marble floor and said, "You mean nothing to me," with a voice like a door closing. That was irrelevant. She contacted the people her mother had once trusted. The ones who were still alive. The ones who had been waiting, in their various quiet ways, for someone to pick up the work where Adiz had left it. "I'm ready," she wrote. The replies came within the hour. By mid-morning, Zara was no longer working alone. And somewhere across the city, in an empire that had survived rivals and betrayals and the particular violence of decades, the walls were beginning, very quietly, to breathe wrong. He just didn't know it yet. Benedetti was dead by Tuesday. Not violently. Or rather, not in any way that announced itself as violence. A cardiac event, the preliminary report said. Sudden. Unexpected for a man of his apparent health. Matteo read the report twice and then set it down and looked at Rico with the specific quality of attention that required no words. "The timing," Rico said. "Yes. Could be coincidence." "Could be," Matteo agreed. He said nothing else. It was not coincidence. He knew it the way he knew most true things. Not through evidence, not yet, but through the accumulated instinct of a man who had lived inside systems of power long enough to feel when one had been touched by a foreign hand. Benedetti had been healthy. Benedetti had also been the man who handled communication between Matteo and the port operations. Who held, in his particular and irreplaceable way, the thread that connected 3 separate revenue channels to their legitimate front structures. Dead at 61 of a cardiac event. 2 days after the Marseille shipment turned around. Matteo folded his hands on the desk and thought about a woman who understood logistics. By Wednesday, the second account was frozen. Different structure from the first. Different country, different regulatory body, different authentication chain. The flag that triggered the review had come from a compliance filing in Luxembourg that Matteo's legal team spent 6 hours trying to trace before determining it had been submitted by an entity that did not exist. A company name. A registration number. Both real in every verifiable sense. Neither corresponding to anything that had ever actually been formed. "It's fabricated," his lawyer said over the phone. The man's voice had the careful flatness of someone trying not to convey panic. "But it's fabricated correctly." Whoever created this documentation understood the exact formatting requirements for a Luxembourg regulatory submission. The authentication codes they're not stolen. They're generated. Someone built a system that produces valid format codes. "From the inside or the outside?" Matteo asked. A pause. "I don't know how to answer that." "Try." "From the outside. But with inside knowledge." Another pause. "Mr. De Luca, this level of technical specificity, it's not a hacker. It's not Volkov's people. This is someone who studied your financial architecture." Matteo thanked him and ended the call. Studied. He looked at the window. The city beyond it moved through its morning, indifferent as always, knowing nothing. She had sat across that counter for 14 months. He had talked. Not about specifics. He had never been that careless. But about principles. About structure. About the nature of loyalty and the way trust operated in closed systems. He had talked the way a man talks when he is, for the first time in years, in the presence of someone who listens without agenda. Or so he had believed. Thursday brought 3 things in quick succession. The first was a message from a family in Palermo with whom he had maintained a careful non-aggression arrangement for 7 years. Brief. Formal. The language of men who had decided to create distance without explaining why. Given current uncertainties, we feel it prudent to reassess our mutual understandings. 7 years of arrangement, dissolved in 2 sentences sent through a junior intermediary, which was itself a message, that the slight was intentional, and the insult deliberate, and someone had said something to Palermo that had made Matteo De Luca seem, suddenly, uncertain. Uncertain was another word for vulnerable. Vulnerable was an invitation. The second was a name. A low-level courier who moved between Matteo's operation and 4 allied networks had been picked up by federal investigators at an airport outside Rome. Not for anything connected to Matteo, for a customs violation so minor it barely registered. But in the process of the stop, his phone had been examined. And on that phone were communication patterns that should not have been visible to anyone looking from the outside. Someone had flagged the courier. had pointed investigators toward a man they had no reason to look at, had known which man to point them toward. The third was the worst. An analyst Matteo trusted, one of only 4 people who had access to the complete map of his operational structure, did not come to work, did not call, did not respond to any contact. By afternoon, Rico confirmed his apartment was empty. Not ransacked, cleaned. The methodical emptying of a man who had been warned. Or paid. Or both. Matteo called a meeting. 8 men in a room with no phones and no windows. Men who had been with him long enough to have earned the particular loyalty that came not from fear but from shared survival. He stood at the head of the table and looked at each face and asked himself, as he always did in these moments, what each one stood to gain from his fall. He came up empty. That was not reassuring. It meant the problem was not in the room. Someone is doing this from the outside, he said. And they have inside knowledge. Not stolen, learned. The kind of learning that takes time. The room waited. They understand the financial structure. They understand the communication networks. They understand which intermediaries are load-bearing and which are peripheral. He paused. They hit Benedetti first. One of his men, a quiet man named Pharaoh, who thought slowly and carefully and was almost never wrong, said, Benedetti was the one who moved the port revenue. Yes. So whoever this is, they're not trying to destroy you. Pharaoh's voice was measured. They're trying to dismantle you, piece by piece, removing the specific pieces that hold weight. The distinction settled over the table like weather. Destroy was blunt. Destruction required only force. Dismantling required a blueprint. He went through it alone that night. Every failure, every frozen account, every vanished ally, every regulatory flag and fabricated document and precisely targeted intermediary. He laid them out chronologically on paper. He still used paper, had always believed that screens made the mind lazy, and looked at the shape of it. It was not random. It was not even strategic in the way his enemies were strategic. From the outside, applying pressure until something cracked. This was internal pressure. As if someone had found the precise points where his operation bore its own weight and was removing them, one by one, with the patience of a person who knew exactly how long the structure could stand before it began to shift. It was surgical. And it was getting faster. He thought about Geneva, about Marseille, about an account in Luxembourg and a filing that required intimate knowledge of authentication systems that 3 people in the world understood. He thought about a cafe, about a counter, about a woman who had never once asked him a direct question about his work and had therefore never needed to. He thought about the way she looked at the reflection in the espresso machine, about the way she learned his moods without being told them, about 14 months of proximity, about the fact that she had left within 48 hours of the estate, faster than someone running from hurt, at exactly the speed of someone executing a plan. His pen stopped moving. He looked at what he had written without knowing he was writing it. Her name. At the center of the page, with 6 operational failures arranged around it like evidence. He sat very still. Not with anger. Not with betrayal, not yet, not the hot kind. With something colder and more clarifying, the feeling of a lie he had told himself becoming visible in full light. He had believed she was ordinary. He had chosen to believe it because the alternative required him to acknowledge that he had been sitting across from someone who understood exactly what he was, and had chosen to stay. For 14 months. For reasons he had not asked. He stood, moved to the window, pressed his hand against the glass the way he had outside the empty cafe, and looked at the city, and thought, she is somewhere in that. And she is not finished. He turned from the window. Rico, he said, though Rico was not in the room. He said it anyway. Into the silence. The name of the man who would begin the search. He had to find her. Not to stop her. He needed to understand what he had been sitting across from every morning for 14 months, and whether any of it, the silence, the coffee, the 30 seconds, his father's name spoken once in a room that still felt different from every other room, whether any of it had been real. He needed to know before it was too late. He was not certain it wasn't already. She knew he was coming 4 hours before he arrived. Not because her network told her, though it did, but because she knew him. Knew the shape of his decision-making, the pace at which a man like Matteo De Luca moved from realization to action. She had watched him for 14 months. She understood his velocity. She had chosen the warehouse accordingly. It sat at the edge of the river district, a building that appeared derelict from the outside and was, on the inside, something else entirely. Clean. Functional. Lit by industrial fixtures that threw hard white light across concrete floors. When Matteo walked through the door at 9:47 p.m., alone, which she had also anticipated, she was standing at the center of the room with a tablet in her hands and 3 people arranged behind her with the quiet precision of those who knew exactly where to be. He stopped when he saw her. She did not move toward him. She did not speak first. That was new. She watched him register it, the shift in the architecture of the room, the weight redistribution. Every other time they had occupied the same space, it had been his. His cafe visits, his estate, his city. Even in the quiet of the counter and the espresso machine, the gravity had been his. Not here. He looked at her for a long moment. At the tablet. At the people behind her. At the room she had built without his knowledge in a city he believed he owned. "You came," she said. "I was wrong." He said it immediately. No preamble, no circling. She had not expected that. The directness of it, the way pride simply wasn't in the room with him tonight. He had left it somewhere between his car and the door, or perhaps further back, in the office where he'd written her name at the center of a page surrounded by ruins. About what specifically, she said, would be a useful clarification. His jaw tightened. Slightly. All of it. That's not specific. Zara. Her name in his mouth. She had not heard it in 11 days. She had not understood, until this moment, that she had been counting. She set the tablet down on the table beside her. Folded her hands. Waited. He crossed the room. Not all the way, not to her, but further in. Far enough that the distance between them became something that required acknowledgement, rather than something that could be pretended away. He stopped. Looked at her face with the focused attention of a man reading something he'd misread before. "Say what you want," he said. "I'll give it." "You already did," she replied. "That night." The silence was not comfortable. It was the silence of 2 people standing on opposite sides of a truth that had been in the room longer than either of them. "You knew," he said. "Not a question. An arrival. I knew within the first hour." She kept her voice even. The audience. The positioning. The words chosen to land in front of witnesses who would carry them. She paused. "You humiliated me to make me worthless. To make me safe." Something moved across his face. She had a name for it now, relief and devastation arriving simultaneously, which happened when a person found out their sacrifice was understood and discovered it didn't make the sacrifice hurt less. "Then you know why I did it," he said. "I know exactly why you did it." Then. "That's not the problem, Matteo." He stopped. She let him stop. Let the weight of what she hadn't said yet sit in the air between them, present and patient. "The problem," she said, "is what you didn't do." She walked to the window. Not away from him. Sideways, parallel, keeping him in her periphery. The river was dark outside, moving without sound through the glass. "There was a moment," she said, "before you called me to the estate. You were in that office of yours, and you had a decision to make, and you made it without once considering a third option." "There wasn't one." "There was." She turned. "You could have told me the truth." The room held that. "You could have called me," she continued, "and said, 'There's a threat. I need you to understand what I am and what that means for your safety, and I need you to help me decide what comes next.'" She looked at him directly. "You didn't. You would have been in more danger with the information." "Don't." Her voice was still even, still controlled, but something under it had an edge. "Don't tell me what I could have handled. You don't get to make that calculation for me." He said nothing. "You chose," she said, "to protect me like a thing, not like a person." She paused. Not like someone you trusted. Matteo looked at her across the distance of the room and understood, for perhaps the first time, the specific taxonomy of what he had done. Not the act, the assumption beneath it. He had looked at the situation, and he had looked at Zara, and he had built a solution that required her to be passive. To be unaware. To be saved by his cleverness and his sacrifice without her knowledge or consent. He had done what men like him always did. He had decided. Alone. I thought I was protecting you, he said. You were protecting your capacity to act without accountability. She said it without cruelty. As a fact. That's different. He could have argued. He found he didn't want to. Not because she would win the argument, though she would, but because the argument would be beside the point, and he was tired, for the first time in years, of being beside the point. What I did on that floor, he said. The words I used were effective, she said. The contract was pulled. I confirmed it through my own channels within 6 days. She held his gaze. They believed you. So did most of your men. But not you. Not completely. She reached for the tablet. Turned it over in her hands once. A habit, he realized, the way he turned his coffee cup. Something done without awareness. I heard the mechanism of it. The construction. She set it back down. But I also. She stopped. The room waited. I also heard you say it, she finished quietly. And knowing why someone destroys something doesn't change that the thing is destroyed. It was the most she had given him. He understood it as what it was. Not forgiveness, not an opening, but a documentation of damage. Precise and honest, because she was precise and honest in everything, and he had spent 14 months benefiting from that quality without understanding its full weight. What do you want from me? He asked. She looked at him for a long moment. I want you to listen, she said. For the first time since you walked into that cafe, without deciding in advance what you're willing to hear. He met her eyes. Dark, steady, entirely unafraid. They had never been afraid of him, and he understood now that it wasn't because she didn't know who he was. It was because she knew exactly who she was. All right, he said. She picked up the tablet. Turned to the board behind her, a physical board, covered in names and structures and connections rendered in precise notation. His empire, he realized, mapped completely. Every artery, every nerve. She had known for months. She had stayed anyway. And she had left only when he made her. He stood in the room she had built and looked at the architecture of everything he thought was secret and felt the particular vertigo of a man discovering the ground has been different than he believed for longer than he can calculate. Sit down, Matteo, she said. Not a request. He sat. She started with her mother's name. Not with evidence. Not with the board behind her or the tablet in her hands or the documented architecture of everything she had spent 10 years building toward. She started with a Dies Okoye, spoken plainly into the warehouse air, and Matteo watched something happen to her face when she said it, a fractional softening, gone before it fully arrived, like a light seen through a closing door. He filed it carefully, the way she had always filed him. She was a journalist, Zara said. 21 years. She covered the kind of stories that require you to understand that the story is more important than your safety. She paused. She believed that completely. That was not always easy to be the child of. She was not asking for sympathy. Her voice made that clear, even factual, the tone of a person giving testimony rather than confession. But the words themselves were something else. They were old, carried a long time. She died 11 years ago, Zara continued. Outside Milan. A wet road. A car accident. Her eyes moved to the board. Away from him. She was 6 weeks from publishing an investigation she had spent 3 years building. Into what? Matteo said. He already felt the answer arriving. Into the financial infrastructure of 7 criminal enterprises operating across Western Europe. She turned back. Met his eyes. Enterprises that had learned to move money through legitimate fronts, real estate, logistics, import-export, with enough layering that the regulatory systems of 4 countries couldn't see the seams. The warehouse was very quiet. She could see them, Zara said. She walked to the board. She did not use the tablet. She used her hand, pointing to structures he recognized, connections he had built or inherited or maintained, names that lived in the deepest layer of his operation where light from the legitimate world didn't reach. Your network is one of 7, she said. Not the largest. Not the oldest. She looked at him over her shoulder. But the most connected. You're the infrastructure the others route through. Not because they trust you, because you built something stable enough that it was cheaper to use than to replicate. He said nothing. My mother identified that 11 years ago. She couldn't prove the full picture. The technology didn't exist yet. The regulatory cooperation between countries wasn't there. She had pieces. Zara turned fully to face him. I have the complete map. He looked at the board. At his own empire rendered in someone else's hand, annotated and cross-referenced with the clinical thoroughness of someone who had approached it the way a surgeon approaches a body, not to inhabit it, but to understand where it could be opened. The investigation she was publishing, he said. If it had come out, 4 of the 7 enterprises would have collapsed within 18 months. The regulatory pressure alone would have been sufficient. She paused. The remaining 3 would have been exposed and isolated. Without the infrastructure. She let that land. Without you. He looked at her. She was killed for it, he said. The case was closed as accidental. Zara's voice did not change. I know it wasn't. I have spent 10 years building the proof. And what does the proof show? She held his gaze. That the order came from within one of the 7. He absorbed this. Which one? That, she said quietly, is the last piece. She came away from the board and sat, not across from him, but beside the table, perching on its edge with her hands folded in her lap. A different posture. Less formal. It made him watch her more carefully, because Zara never changed her posture without reason. I want to tell you something, she said. Before we go further. He waited. When I took the cafe job, you were a node. A connection point. I needed proximity to your operation to understand how the financial routing worked. Which of the 7 you were carrying, how deeply, in which direction. She looked at her hands. I was not there for you personally. I know. I stayed. She stopped. Started again. The 14 months was longer than necessary. I had what I needed operationally within 8. The warehouse settled around this. You stayed 6 months beyond operational necessity, he said. Yes. In a cafe. Making espresso. Yes. He looked at her. Why? She lifted her eyes to his. Direct. Unflinching. And in them, for just a moment, the thing she had been controlling since he walked through the door became visible. Not soft. Not broken. But real. The realness of something that had cost her something to carry. You know why, she said. He did. God help him, he did. She stood. The moment sealed itself. Back to business. He watched her make the transition and understood it was necessary, that she could not afford to stand in that exposure longer than she already had. My mission is to finish what my mother started, she said. The investigation goes public. Not through me. Through the right channels, the right journalists, the right regulatory bodies in 3 countries who have been waiting for this documentation for a decade. She looked at him steadily. When it does, it will dismantle the network. All 7 enterprises. The money stops moving. The fronts are exposed. The people who built their safety on invisibility become visible. And me, he said. And you. The words sat between them. Simple. Enormous. I'm part of the system you're destroying, he said. You're the connective tissue, she said, without which the system cannot function. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands loose, looking at the floor for a moment, then back at her. And my people. The men who. The operation ends, she said. What happens to the people within it depends on what they've done and what they're willing to do next. She didn't look away. That calculation is separate from yours. You've been making this calculation for 10 years, he said. You've already decided what happens to me. I decided what happens to the empire, she corrected. What happens to you? Something shifted, briefly, in her expression. That depends on you. She told him the choice plainly. Because she was Zara Okoye, and plainness was a form of respect she extended even to this. You can step aside, she said. Cooperate with the documentation. Provide the financial records that close the last gap in the investigation, the gap that identifies who ordered my mother's death. In exchange, the cooperation becomes part of the record. What the regulatory bodies do with that is not mine to control, but the cooperation matters. He was very still. Or, she said, I finish the dismantling I've already started. Without your help. It takes longer. It's messier. The last piece, she paused. The last piece I may never find without you. And the person who killed your mother, he said. They stay protected. Yes. He looked at her. You're asking me to burn it down, he said. Everything. I'm asking you to choose what you're willing to burn it for. She crossed her arms. Not defensively, a settling. A woman who had said the things she came to say and was now waiting. For you, he asked. For everyone, she said. Including yourself. The silence that followed was the longest of the night. He did not fill it. She did not help him. The people behind her were still and quiet, and the river moved outside the window, and the light held everything in its hard white clarity. Mateo looked at his hands. He thought about his father, dying in an ordinary room. About a city he had believed was his. About a woman who had sat across a counter from him for 14 months and listened without agenda, or so he had believed, and who had, in every conversation, been more honest with him than anyone in his life. She had never lied. She had simply not told him all of the truth. He understood that distinction more intimately than anyone. He looked up. He opened his mouth. And then he closed it. Because the answer was already there. Had been there since he stood outside the empty cafe with his hand pressed against dark glass and felt for the first time the specific weight of something he could not replace. He just needed a moment to understand what it was going to cost. His expression shifted. Barely. The outline of a man setting something down that he had been carrying for a very long time. Zara watched him. She waited. He made the first call at midnight. Not to Rico. Not to Caruso. To a man in Brussels who had spent 19 years as the financial architect of everything Mateo had built. A quiet, precise man named Holt who understood money the way surgeons understood bodies, as systems with predictable failures if you knew where to press. I need the ledgers, Mateo said. A pause. The kind that contained an entire conversation. All of them? Holt asked. All of them. Another pause. Longer. Holt was not a man who panicked. Panic was inefficient, and inefficiency offended him. But Mateo could hear him recalibrating. Reassessing. Running the mathematics of what this request meant against the mathematics of what refusal would cost. When? Holt said finally. Tomorrow morning. Physical copies and digital. Everything. The line was quiet for 4 seconds. Mateo. Holt's voice was careful. Careful in the way of a man who had never needed to be careful before. If you do this, I know what I'm doing. The others will. I know, he said. Do it anyway. He ended the call. Sat in the silence of his office. Looked at the city through the window. His city, which had never actually been his, which had only ever been borrowed from time and violence and the willingness to maintain both. He picked up the phone again. The list was long. He began. By 3 a.m. he had made 11 calls. Each one was different in tone. Some were short, men who understood immediately, who needed only the fact of the thing and then ended the conversation because there was nothing left to say. Some were longer. One man wept. Not from grief, from fury, the shaking kind, the kind that lives in the body long after the mind has accepted the inevitable. Mateo listened without flinching and said the same thing he had said to all of them. It's over. What you do next is your own. 3 of the 11 threatened him. He wrote their names down. Not as a list of enemies, as a list of men who had revealed their character in the moment it cost them something. He set the paper aside. It would matter to someone. Later. Rico appeared in the doorway at 4. He did not knock. He never knocked. He stood there with the expression of a man who had been awake since the first call, tracking the shape of what was happening through the secondary ripples it sent through every network he monitored. "You're doing it," Rico said. "Not a question." "Yes. All of it." "Yes." Rico looked at him for a long moment. He was not a sentimental man. Sentiment had no operational value, he had always said. But something moved across his face now that Mateo had no name for, because he had never seen it on Rico before. "Then I need to know," Rico said quietly. "Is this for her or for you?" Mateo looked at him. "Does it change anything?" he asked. Rico considered this seriously, the way he considered everything. Then, "No. Then it doesn't matter." Rico nodded once. Came into the room. Sat across the desk for the first time in 11 years without being asked. "Tell me what you need," he said. The ledgers arrived at dawn. Holt delivered them personally. 3 cases, physical and digital both, the complete financial history of an empire built across 2 decades and 4 countries. He set them on the desk without ceremony and looked at Mateo with a flat, assessing gaze of a man trying to determine if the person across from him was sane. "You understand what these contain," Holt said. "I built what they contain. Then you understand that when these go to the authorities—" "Not only the authorities," Mateo said. Holt stilled. "Who else?" "Journalists. The right ones." He thought of Adiz Okoye, of a woman who had carried her mother's ring on her 4th finger for 10 years like a compass needle always pointing toward north. People who know how to make sure the information can't be buried. Holt sat down uninvited. He looked at the cases and then at Mateo with something that might, on a different face, have been close to respect. "3 of the 7 are going to come for you," he said. "I know. Volkov alone. I know, Holt. You'll have no protection. No network. No. I know what I'll have." Mateo looked at him steadily. "Prepare the documentation for transfer. By noon." Holt left without another word. The cases sat on the desk in the early light like evidence of something that hadn't happened yet. Mateo put his hand on the nearest one. Flat. The way he pressed his hand against glass. Then he opened it and began. The first allies fell by morning. The Palermo family, who had sent their careful 2-sentence withdrawal 3 days ago, learned at 9 a.m. that the financial routing they had used through Mateo's infrastructure for 7 years had been documented and submitted to regulatory bodies in Italy and Switzerland. By 10, their lawyers were making calls. By 11, 2 of their senior men had been detained for questioning. Palermo called once. A man Mateo had met 17 times over the course of a decade, who had sat at tables with him and eaten and made arrangements with the easy confidence of men who believe they are permanent. "You've killed yourself," the man said. "Possibly," Mateo agreed. "We will." "Do what you need to do," Mateo said. "I've done what I needed to do." He ended the call. The second enterprise fell faster. They had been the most exposed. Their routing through Mateo's infrastructure was not supplementary but primary, which meant the documentation didn't just implicate them, it rendered them visible in their entirety. By afternoon, 3 senior figures had been contacted by federal investigators. 1 cooperated immediately. 1 disappeared. 1 was found in a car outside Geneva with the specific stillness of a man who had understood what cooperation would mean and chosen the alternative. The city felt it. Not in ways civilians would notice. Not in headlines. Not yet. Not until the journalists Zara's network had placed the documentation with were ready to move simultaneously across 4 countries. But in the infrastructure beneath the city, in the channels and arrangements and careful handshakes that kept the invisible economy moving, something had shifted. A vibration. A wrongness. The feeling of a load-bearing wall developing a crack. Mateo moved through it all with a steadiness that surprised even him. He had expected to feel something specific. Grief, perhaps, or the particular vertigo of watching something he'd built disappear. Instead, he felt something closer to clarity. The sensation of a man who has been carrying weight for so long he forgot it was weight and is only now, setting it down, understanding what standing upright actually feels like. Caruso came at dusk. He did not sit. He stood in the doorway of the office that had contained, for 11 years, the decisions that built and maintained an empire, and he looked at Matteo with an expression that combined fury and sorrow in equal measure. "Your father," Caruso said, "would not recognize you." Matteo looked at him. "My father died in an ordinary room," he said. "He always said ordinary rooms were the safest." He paused. "I'm beginning to think he was right." Caruso shook his head, turned, stopped. "They'll come for you," he said without turning back. "Volkov's people, the Third Enterprise, when they understand the full scope of what you've handed over. Let them come." "Matteo." "I'm not asking you to stay, Caruso." A long silence. "No," Caruso said. "I don't suppose you are." He walked out. Matteo listened to the footsteps crossing marble, growing smaller, then gone. The same sound as 11 days ago. A different kind of leaving. By midnight the underworld was on fire. Not visibly. Not yet. But in the channels Zara's network monitored, in the regulatory systems of 4 countries receiving simultaneous documentation, in the communications of 7 enterprises discovering simultaneously that the infrastructure they had relied on had been handed to their enemies, in all of it, the vibration had become something else. A collapse. Beginning slowly. Then faster. Rico appeared one final time. Placed a single page on the desk. Looked at Matteo. "Volkov has sent people," he said. "They crossed the border 2 hours ago." "How many?" "Enough." Matteo nodded. "And the documentation?" "Delivered. All of it. Every channel, every journalist, every regulatory body." Rico paused. "It's done." It was done. Matteo sat in the office that would not be his tomorrow, in the chair that had contained a decade of decisions, and felt the empire finish its falling, not with violence, not with the sound he would have expected, but with the particular silence of a thing that has been dismantled rather than destroyed, piece by piece, by 2 people who had, between them, known exactly where each piece held weight. He stood. He had somewhere to be. And for the first time in 11 years, he was going there without protection. He found her at dawn. Not through her network. They had gone quiet, distributed back into their separate channels now that the documentation was moving and the work had entered its next phase, the phase that belonged to regulators and journalists and the slow machinery of institutional consequence. He found her the way he had found everything real in the last 2 weeks, by following the logic of who she was to the place she would go when the work was done and the room was empty. The cafe was still dark. Closed. But the building beside it had an access staircase she had shown him once, months ago, pointing upward when he'd asked about the neighborhood. "Good view from the roof, if you don't mind the climb," and he had filed it the way he filed everything she said. She was there, standing at the edge with her coat pulled closed against the cold, looking out over a city that was beginning, very slowly, to understand that something beneath it had changed. She did not turn when he came through the door. She had heard him on the stairs. He stopped a few feet behind her. Neither of them spoke. Below, the streets were empty in the early light. Somewhere distant, sirens, the ordinary kind, unrelated to anything, just the city breathing. A pigeon adjusted itself on a railing. The river was silver. "It's done," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been watching." She turned eventually, and he saw it happen, the thing he had wondered about since the warehouse, since the board and the tablet and sit down, Matteo said in the voice of a woman who had decided she would not be arranged around him anymore. He had wondered what she would see when she looked at him without the empire behind him. Without the men at the door and the car with tinted windows and the particular gravity that power lent to ordinary features. She looked now. He stood on a rooftop in a coat that cost more than it needed to, without guards, without protection, with Volkov's people 2 hours behind him and every alliance he had built or inherited or maintained now either dismantled or turned hostile. He was 43 hours from being no one. He was already no one. He just hadn't finished becoming it yet. Zara looked at him with those steady dark eyes, and he waited for something. Satisfaction, perhaps, or the cool vindication of a person who had spent 10 years working toward a moment and arrived at it. He had earned either. He would accept both. What he saw was more complicated. What he saw was a woman who had loved someone and was now encountering the question of whether the someone she loved had ever actually existed, or whether he had been, all along, a story she'd told herself in the margins of a mission she'd never intended to survive emotionally. He recognized that question. He had been asking it about her for 2 weeks. "You should have a car," she said. "Somewhere. Someone who can move you. Rico is handling it. Volkov's people are a problem for tomorrow." He looked at her. "This is tonight." She turned back to the city, wrapped her arms around herself. Not cold, he understood. Contained. The particular self-holding of a person deciding something they haven't finished deciding. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "The last piece." She paused. "The identity of the person who ordered my mother's death. It was in the ledgers." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. He watched the line of her shoulders, still, controlled, giving nothing away. But he had spent 14 months learning the difference between her stillness and her silence, and this was not stillness. This was the body bracing. "Who was it?" she said. It wasn't a question. She knew it wasn't a question. She was asking him to say it aloud because she had found it in the documentation herself and needed to hear it confirmed by a human voice. He told her. A name. 6 letters. The head of the Third Enterprise. A man she had circled on her board without ever being able to close the line that connected him to Milan, to a wet road, to a case closed in 4 months. The line was closed now. She absorbed it without sound. Her profile against the pale sky gave him nothing. He watched her breathe, one breath, two, and then she nodded once, the small precise nod of a person who has received information they spent 10 years hunting and find, upon receiving it, that it does not feel the way they thought it would. "He's in the documentation," Matteo said. "Everything. The order, the payment, the cover. It's there." "I know," she said. "I found it at midnight." He waited. "She knew," Zara said softly. "My mother." She had gotten close enough that he understood what she was going to publish. Her voice was even. Careful. The voice she used when the thing she was saying cost her something. She was right about all of it. Yes. And she died for it. Yes. Silence. "And now it's out," she said. "All of it. Everything she found and everything I found." She paused. "She's finished." The word landed strangely, not finished in failure, but finished in completion. The work done. The decade closed. Her mother's investigation, published at last by the right hands in the right places, 11 years late and finally, irrevocably, real. He watched her stand in that. He did not speak. Because some moments were not for speaking, and he had learned, too late, and then just in time, that she needed witness more than she needed words. After a while she turned from the city and looked at him, and the calculation in her eyes was different now. More open. More dangerous. "You gave up everything," she said. "Yes. Your protection. Your alliances. Yes. People will come for you. Probably. You did it anyway." He looked at her. "Yes." She studied him the way she had studied him from behind a counter for 14 months. That careful, total attention that had always felt different from observation because it included something observation didn't. Something that had no operational value and therefore should not have been there. "I need to know something," she said. "What?" "If I hadn't been there. If there was no investigation, no mission, no ledgers, no 10 years of work." She held his eyes. "If I had just been a woman in a cafe who knew how to make your coffee correctly." She paused. Would any of this have happened? He understood the real question. She was asking if she was the reason. And if she was the reason, whether that meant the sacrifice was real, or whether it was a transaction. Whether he had bought something with the Empire or paid a debt. Whether love and strategy, in a man like him, could ever be fully untangled from each other. He held the question honestly. He gave it the silence it deserved. "No," he said. "It wouldn't have happened." Her expression shifted. "But that's not." He stopped. "Started differently. You didn't create the decision. You made it possible." He looked at his hands briefly. I've known for years what this was. What I was. He looked back up. I didn't have a reason to choose differently. And I was the reason. You were the proof, he said, that a different choice existed. She looked at him for a long time. He could not read her, which had never been true before. He had always been able to read the conclusion her logic was moving toward, even when she gave him nothing visible. But now she was somewhere he couldn't follow. Somewhere the maps he had of her didn't reach. Zara, he said. She held up one hand. Barely. The smallest gesture. Not stop. Not enough. Just wait. He waited. She looked at the city again. Her mother's ring caught the early light. Gold, thin, turning slowly as she pressed it with her thumb. He watched her do it and understood, for the first time, what the gesture meant. Not habit. Not grounding. Asking. She was asking the ring something. Asking the woman who wore it first. The city offered no advice. The river moved. The light grew slowly. He stood on the roof of a building beside an empty cafe and waited for a woman to decide whether the man standing before her, stripped of everything that had made him dangerous and nothing, yet of what might make him worth keeping, was someone she could trust with whatever came next. She said nothing. That was the most terrifying thing he had ever encountered. And he had been in rooms with men who killed for sport. She was still there when the sun fully cleared the horizon. Mateo had not moved. Neither had she. The city below had begun its morning, the sounds of it rising slowly, engines and doors and the ordinary percussion of people resuming their lives without any awareness that something beneath those lives had fundamentally changed overnight. They stood on the roof in the growing light, and the silence between them had become something neither cold nor warm. Something that simply was. Like weather. Like the river. Like a question that had been asked and was still being answered. My mother used to say, Zara said finally, that the most dangerous thing a person could do was tell the truth to someone who had built their life on not hearing it. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the city. She meant the people she wrote about, Zara continued. The men in the rooms. The systems. A pause. I think she also meant herself. Mateo waited. She told the truth in print for 21 years. Zara's voice was even. Careful. The voice she used when the words mattered too much to risk with emphasis. And she was alone for most of them. Not unhappily. But alone. She finally turned. Because the truth was the thing she loved most. And most people couldn't live inside it. He looked at her. Is that a warning? He said. It's a question, she said. Whether you can. He crossed the roof. Not quickly. With the deliberate pace of a man who understood that arrival mattered, that the space between them was not empty but full of everything that had not yet been said, and that moving through it carelessly would cost him something he couldn't afford to lose again. He stopped 2 feet from her. Close enough that the distance was a choice rather than a default. Ask it plainly, he said. Whatever you need to ask. She looked at him, that full, unguarded looking she had always done, the kind that had nothing in common with the way his men looked at him or his enemies looked at him or even the way people who admired him looked at him. She looked at him like a problem she found genuinely interesting. Like something worth the effort of understanding correctly. Did you mean it? She said. That night. He did not pretend not to know which night. No, he said. Say what you meant. He held her gaze. You know what I meant. I know what I concluded, she said. That's different. I've been wrong about conclusions before. The smallest pause. Once. He understood she meant him. Say it, she said again. Quietly. Without pressure. The way she left silence open, not demanding, just honest about what the moment required. He had kept things unsaid for so long that the habit of it had become structural. Part of how he moved through the world. Part of what had kept him standing in rooms where speaking was the most dangerous thing a person could do. Silence was protection. Silence was control. He looked at her and understood that here, now, silence was neither. You were the only real thing, he said. In years. He paused. Not for effect, for accuracy. Because she deserved accuracy. I told myself it was manageable. That I could keep it contained. That I could. He stopped. I lied to myself longer than I lied to you. That's not an excuse. It's the truth of the order. She was very still. When I stood in that room, he said, and said what I said, every word was a choice. I made it knowing what it would do. He held her eyes. Not to protect you from them. To protect you. From what happens to things I keep close. A pause. I have a history of destroying what I value. By keeping it or by releasing it? She asked. He thought about this honestly. Both, he said. She turned away. Not in retreat. He understood the difference now. She turned the way she turned to the espresso machine when she needed a moment to be in her body rather than her mind. He watched her hands close briefly on the roof railing. Release. I spent 10 years, she said, building something that required me to stay separate from it. From everything. From everyone. She paused. The work was the reason I was careful. The work was why I couldn't. She stopped. Started again. The work was also what I hid behind. He was quiet. When you came into the cafe, she said, you were a target. Clean and clear and professionally necessary. She looked down at the street below. By month 4 you were a complication. By month 8, she paused. By month 8 I had what I needed operationally, and I stayed anyway, and I told myself it was for the mission. Was it? No. Simple. Direct. The only way she knew how to say the things that cost her. It wasn't. He said nothing. I was angry at you, she said. After the estate. Not for what you did. I told you I understood what you did. I was angry because it confirmed something I was afraid of. She finally looked back at him. That I had made myself matter to someone who would always choose the calculation. You were right, he said. Then. I know. And now? He asked. She looked at him steadily. Now I'm standing on a roof with a man who has no empire, no protection, and enemies closing in, who drove himself here without guards to stand in the cold and wait for a woman who may or may not. She stopped. Who may or may not what? He said. She held his gaze. Who may or may not have already decided, she said. The city moved below them. Unhurried. Indifferent in the way of cities, which absorbed everything, empire and ruin, beginning and end, and continued their breathing regardless. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Mateo said. I know. I'm not asking for anything. He paused. I'm telling you what was true. What I should have said in a warehouse 2 weeks ago instead of. You said enough in the warehouse. Not everything. She waited. He looked at her, at the coat pulled close against the morning cold, at the ring on her 4th finger catching light, at the face that had looked at him without fear from the first moment and had never once looked at him with anything other than the full, unmanaged truth of what it was seeing. I love you, he said. No architecture. No construction. Nothing strategic. Just the words, plain and final as a door opening. She looked at him for a long time. Something moved in her eyes. Not surprise, because she had always seen too clearly for surprise, but something that had been waiting for confirmation. The difference between knowing a thing and hearing it said. Between concluding and receiving. That's the first entirely unguarded sentence you've said to me, she said softly. Yes. In 14 months. Yes. She pressed her mother's ring against her palm. The gesture that meant she was asking something. He understood now. He waited for the answer the same way she had always waited for his truth, without rushing, without filling the space, without needing the silence to be anything other than what it was. Then we start with that, she said. Not I love you. Not yet. He did not need it yet. He had not earned its easy return. He understood the difference between a beginning and a completion. She was offering a beginning. He had burned everything for it. No more calculation, she said. No more protection that looks like cruelty. No more decisions made for me without me. No, he agreed. And no more hiding, she said. Not what you are. Not what this is. Not anymore, he said. There's nothing left to hide it behind. She looked at him. The man without the kingdom. Without the guards, the weight, the decades of careful silence built around something he'd been unwilling to name. Just a man. Standing in the cold. Completely seen. She reached out, not dramatically, not with a sweeping gesture of spectacle, and placed her hand flat against his chest. Over his heart. A simple pressure. Present and still. He put his hand over hers. The city continued below them, knowing nothing, caring nothing, offering its indifferent and essential witness to two people deciding, quietly, without audience, without performance, to build something on ground that was honest for the first time. Not an empire. Something harder to construct and harder to destroy. The truth between them settled into place like a bone that had been broken, setting properly at last. Not painless. Not instant. But right. Below, a car turned onto the street. Dark. Moving slowly. Zara felt him notice it. Felt the shift in his attention. The old instinct, the trained awareness that had kept him alive for decades rising even now, even here, even stripped of everything it had once protected. She did not remove her hand. "We'll need to move soon," she said quietly. "Yes. I know somewhere safe." He looked at her. "Of course you do," he said. And for the first time, in 14 months of mornings and one catastrophic night and the long difficult weeks of dismantling and truth, she smiled. Small. Real. Gone quickly. But real. They turned from the railing together. Thank you for watching Afro Korean Tales and Stories. If this story stayed with you, there are more waiting here. Subscribe to Afro Korean Tales and Stories for a love that crosses cultures and lingers. Tell us in the comments, what emotion are you leaving this story with?